They laughed when he slipped the ring on her finger, certain it was just a cruel joke, a bet dressed up as vows. But what they didn't realize was that the maid they mocked was already memorizing every room, every whisper, every signature that would one day be hers. By the time the tide turned, the punchline had become the headline, and she wasn't just in the house anymore, she owned it. Stay with us. Because what begins as a mockery ends in a takeover. Drop your city in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated, only to rise and claim everything they thought you'd never touch? Seabright breathed like the ocean it faced. Glass rib cage, marble spine, and 1,000 soft lights that pulsed in the hallways like a heartbeat, too practiced to be natural. Zuri Hayes moved through it the way a violinist moves through silence, aware of every echo and every eye that pretended not to see her. The night shift made its own weather, citrus polish in the air, the hush of tides pressing their foreheads against the seawall, the distant clink of ice in glasses that cost more than rent. Walnut skin kissed by lamplight, braids pinned close. She slipped a hand towel along a banister until the mahogany flashed like still water. The house liked to be admired. It didn't mind if respect arrived in the uniform pockets of a woman whose name the guest list never learned. Tonight, the estate played host to the sort of gathering that was really a performance. Investors who laughed one notch too loud, wives with smiles practiced for photographs, sons who treated legacy like a credit line. Zuri kept to the edges, which is also where truth lived. She could tell who was new money by the cologne, who was old by the shoes, who felt small by the way they ordered other people to shrink. In the salon, a screen over the bar broadcast a muted feed of a live stream, a party across town where Sloane Hart, platinum hair and teeth like a flashbulb, narrated her own life to 1 million followers. Words scrolled, hearts burst in the corner, the sound low but knife clean. Zuri didn't linger. She had water rings to erase, orchids to mist, and a silver tray to lift with the steadiness of someone who understood that dignity is something you carry, not something you're given. Sterling Vale arrived with the ocean at his back and champagne on his breath. Ice blue eyes, jaw carved by a Jim and a last name, he wore his suit like a birthright and his grin like armor. The room reoriented to him out of habit, men angling their shoulders, women angling their chins, because proximity to power feels like power until the bill comes due. At the bar, his friends gathered, sleek as yachts, Roman with a watch that winked like a lie, Cade with hunger simmering just under the skin, Harrison, who never said anything that couldn't be repeated to a banker. Someone unmuted Sloane's feed just in time to catch her punchline. "Sterling?" She purred to the camera. The vowels lengthened until they sounded expensive. "He's a placeholder with a trust fund. You can rent his attention by the bottle." They howled. He smiled the way a glass smiles when it cracks. Everything looks the same until you touch it. He shrugged for them, lifted his flute, swallowed the bruise. "I could marry anyone in this room and be above her by breakfast," he said lightly, too lightly, the words slicked with bravado. Laughter rose like a flock. Roman slapped the bar. "Anyone?" "That's a bet I'd fund." Cade leaned in, wolf-hungry. "Prove it. Make it a story. Make it art." The dare metastasized the way rich men's amusement does. Quick, careless, lethal. Phones lifted. Someone filmed for the private group chat that was never really private. Sterling turned, maybe to the crowd, maybe to his pride, and then Zuri stepped into the frame because service steps in when performance needs a backdrop. She lifted the silver tray and the flutes chimed like small bells. The room tilted toward her the way a lens tilts, not to see her but to use her shape for focus. "Her," Roman said, delighted by his own cruelty. "Make it the maid." The word hit the marble and skittered under the rugs. Zuri's eyes did not flicker. She had been a dozen words in her life: maid, girl, help, honey, and none of them had ever learned how to own her. She set the tray on the bar, balanced, precise. Sterling looked at her as if she were a convenient stage. She looked at him as if he were a spill she could clean in 2 motions. "Don't be absurd," Harrison laughed. "He won't do it." Sterling's grin sharpened, the performance inside the performance. He reached into his pocket and produced a ring that wasn't a ring at all. His signet, removed with theatrical slowness. It was the kind of gesture a camera understands. "Why not?" he said, and faced Zuri as though she had auditioned for this. "Marry me." The room became a held breath. The ocean pressed its ear to the windows. Zuri could hear the click-scratch of someone's manicure against a phone case, could smell the cucumber and the champagne and the salt on the air and the astringent bite of humiliation looking for a place to sit. She met his gaze, not his balance sheet, not his audience. Up close, his eyes were colder, a glacier pretending to be a pool. "If you're mocking me," she said, voice low enough to respect the house and steady enough to re-educate it, "mock me to my face." It should have shamed him. It thrilled the audience instead. The laughter came in a second wave, the kind that mistakes bravery for banter. "Face," Roman echoed, drunk on narrative. "There's your caption." Sterling's mouth quirked. He lifted the signet as if it were a crown. "A vow's a vow," he said, meaning the opposite. In the corner, Sloane's feed caught fire, the comments multiplying, the algorithm scenting blood. Someone whispered, "Do it. Make it go viral." Someone else said, "Tell the PR team to prep a statement." Zuri did not step back. She did not blush. Her hands that knew every grain in the Seabright banisters, every stubborn corner of marble that needed more elbow than elegance, remained at her sides. She felt the weight of Mama Pearl's locket beneath her blouse, a coin of memory pressed to her sternum. She felt Mr. Dawson's quiet gaze from the doorway, the way Chef Camilla stilled by the service corridor, a whisk suspended mid-air. The staff was a constellation. She was one star refusing to burn out for anyone's show. Sterling's friends began to chant softly, a joke dressed as ritual. "Do it. Do it." He slid the signet along his knuckle and reached for her hand as if hands were props. The camera lens yawned open, thirsting. Zuri lifted her palm, not to receive, but to refuse. "You don't know my name," she said, not a question. He blinked, the first crack in the mask. He opened his mouth, closed it. The room loved him enough to rescue him. "It's, who cares?" Harrison supplied, to group laughter. "She'll be Mrs. Vale." The laughter was the point. It always had been. Zuri felt it pass over her like a cold front and die on the far wall. She picked up the silver tray again, the metal cool and honest against her skin. "You gentlemen have what you came for," she said, eyes on Sterling because respect, like contempt, should be delivered directly. "But you don't have me." It should have ended there, in a small teaching, in the house regaining its pulse. But bets change weather. Roman lifted his phone higher. "Look at the camera," he urged Sterling. "Say something legendary." And so he did what boys do when their manhood is crowdfunded. He caught Zuri's wrist, not hard enough to bruise, just firm enough to claim, and slid the ring to the first knuckle before she could tilt away. It stuck there, wrong and gleaming. The room erupted as if something holy had occurred. Somewhere a cork sighed. Somewhere the ocean went very still. Zuri's eyes found his again, and this time he saw that what lived there wasn't fear. It was a ledger being opened where only he would owe. She eased her wrist free, lifted the signet with 2 fingers, and set it on the bar between them with a soft, final click. The sound cut through the laughter like a gavel no one had expected, but everyone recognized. The camera didn't blink. Neither did she. He smiled wider because that is what you do when you are drowning in the shallow end, and image is the only thing that floats. "We're engaged," he announced, and the house, eager for a story to dine on, swallowed the line whole. Zuri lifted the tray to her shoulder, spine straight as a mast in a storm. She stepped back into the current of work, glasses chiming, floors gleaming, the night resuming its choreography as if nothing irreversible had just happened. But in the place where a ring had touched her skin, there was a coolness, like a promise made to the self and kept. Somewhere beyond the glass, a wave rose, gathered itself, and broke. Inside, a domino tipped. And the house, Seabright, with its watchful windows and expensive secrets, felt, for the first time in a long time, the shift of an approaching tide. The estate was dressed like a cathedral made for cameras rather than God. Chandeliers hung low, dripping crystal light that caught in sequined gowns, and the glossy hair of guests who thrived on the performance of giving. The Vales had billed it as a charity gala, an evening where philanthropy and matrimony would merge under one ceiling. But everyone knew charity was a costume. The true purpose was to polish the family's image until it gleamed brighter than the frost-lit glass above them. Vivian Vale orchestrated the evening with a smile sharp enough to slice. She stood at the entrance in a gown of silver silk that clung to her like a sheath, her hand grazing the elbows of senators' wives and hedge fund titans with equal ease. She kissed cheeks, murmured praise, and whispered reminders to Zuri whenever no one was watching. Shoulders back, chin down. Don't stare too long at the cameras. It makes you look desperate. And smile, but not wide. Teeth are for commoners. Her voice was sugar with ground glass. Zuri entered the ballroom in a gown of moonlight satin. No couture house had touched it. No stylist had pinned it. Yet it carried her as if it had been waiting for her body alone. Against her collarbone lay Mama Pearl's locket, small and warm, a relic of women who had endured without marble floors or armies of staff. She did not need borrowed diamonds to declare her worth. Still, the crowd assessed her as if she were a purchase, tilting their heads in silent appraisals. Maid or wife, mistake or miracle, novelty or nuisance. The vows were exchanged with a precision that belonged to business transactions, not to lovers. Sterling's voice was steady but hollow, his champagne grin stretched for the benefit of flashing bulbs. Zuri's own vow trembled in her throat before she forced it into stillness. Words that should have meant promise tasted like ash. Applause followed, polite and practiced, more like a verdict than a blessing. The sound pressed against her chest, cold and final. Sterling squeezed her hand when the photographers leaned in, the gesture staged, affectionate enough to sell the story. But as soon as the final camera lowered, his fingers slipped away like water. The absence was louder than the grip had ever been. He turned to accept congratulations from his circle, leaving her a fraction of a step behind, alone, but still in the frame. At the reception table, a lawyer in a slate-gray suit slid the prenup toward her across a slab of white marble. His smile was smug, the ink freshly dried. The document was aggressive, airtight, designed to remind her that even in marriage, she would remain a guest in their empire. Zuri held the pen, the weight of the room pressing her toward humiliation. But she did not flinch. She read the clauses, noted the loopholes, memorized the signatures already in place. This wasn't surrender. This was reconnaissance. She signed because she had already chosen the battlefield. The outcome would not be decided by their traps or their signatures. It would be decided by her resolve, by her ability to turn their stage into her arena. The marble swallowed the scratch of her pen, and when she lifted her gaze, she did not see wolves. She saw opponents who had mistaken her silence for defeat. She tucked the locket back against her skin, breathed once, and stepped into the part of the story that would belong to her alone. Seabright in the daylight was a house that gleamed like a blade, but after the wedding it shifted into something else. An echo chamber, a stage where every glance carried weight and every silence was a form of surveillance. The staff, once her comrades, no longer met her eyes the way they had when she carried trays instead of wearing a ring. Some looked frightened, as though proximity to her could bring consequences they couldn't afford. Others carried a quiet resentment, the kind born from feeling betrayed by someone who crossed a line and never returned. She was no longer Zuri the housekeeper, dependable and invisible. She was Mrs. Vale, and that meant she was either threat or spectacle depending on who was watching. Mr. Dawson, the house manager with hair the color of ash and posture as straight as a soldier on parade, remained the one constant. His loyalty was never to the family name, but to the dignity of the house itself, and in his eyes, Zuri could still find steadiness. When he greeted her, it was with the same warm courtesy as before, the same soft hands that had taught her which banister creaked in the east wing and which guest bedrooms had locks that stuck in summer. It was not allegiance to her, not yet, but it was not betrayal either. In Seabright, that neutrality was a form of defiance. In the kitchen, Chef Camilla, round-cheeked and sharp-tongued, made her quiet allegiance known in gestures too small for Vivian's eyes. A plate of pastelitos would appear beside Zuri's tea at breakfast, no note attached, no explanation. It was sustenance, yes, but also truce, a reminder that not every battle line drawn in the house would leave her stranded. Camilla's knives were loud when she worked, her laughter louder, and Zuri found comfort in both, the rebellion of sound in a home where silence was currency. Vivian turned every morning meal into a campaign. The breakfast table gleamed with porcelain cups that clicked like sabers, her voice soft but serrated. She arranged seating as though preparing for siege, deciding which investor's wife would sit near which senator, which relative would be placed beside Zuri as a form of test or punishment. Every time Zuri lifted a spoon or reached for cream, Vivian's gaze pressed against her skin, reminding her that she was a placeholder, a cautionary tale meant to be endured, not embraced. Sterling was a ghost who smelled of cologne and contrition. He arrived at 2 a.m. with murmured apologies, brushing her shoulder as if proximity could erase absence. By dawn, he was gone again, his name flashing across gossip columns, his grin captured beneath headlines that never once included hers. He existed in fragments, and each one left behind a residue of exhaustion Zuri had to wipe clean herself. So she learned the house by its echoes. She memorized where contracts were whispered, near the terrace where the ocean swallowed sound, and where secrets were stored, in drawers too polished for dust but heavy with silence. She noticed how the family portraits tilted slightly when the Atlantic winds pressed hard against the glass, as though even painted ancestors strained to turn away from the storms outside. Seabright taught her its language, one rule at a time, most of them unspoken, and Zuri, silent but watchful, began to catalog each of them, not as a prisoner might, but as a strategist would, because she understood that every war begins not with battle, but with observation. The truth of Seabright was written not in marble, but in paper. Zuri had known that long before her title changed, long before she was paraded down the aisle like a prop dressed in satin. A housekeeper always learns where the hidden things live. Letters slipped into drawers, invoices stacked behind porcelain vases, the folder that should have been locked but never was because men like Sterling thought their power was fortress enough. She wasn't stealing, she was seeing, and once you teach your eyes to see, it's impossible to unlearn. The first trail revealed itself in something small, a catering invoice filed twice under 2 different shell names. At first glance, it was nothing more than clerical laziness, but Zuri had polished enough brass plates with company names on them to know when an address didn't exist. She began to notice a rhythm, a pattern of duplications and diversions, like a magician forcing the audience to look at one hand while the other pocketed the coin. The Vale Family Foundation, heralded at galas for its generosity, gave less than it claimed and siphoned more than it should. The numbers told the truth men's mouths never would. Late one night, when Sterling was out chasing another headline and Vivian had retired to her suite of mirrors and vintage perfume, Zuri found herself in the library where legal briefs slept beneath leather-bound spines. There she met Elias Cortez, a junior associate working past midnight with the hollow-eyed persistence of someone whose conscience had teeth. He was young, Cuban-American, his tie loosened, his desk stacked with documents the senior partners had told him to file and forget. He offered her coffee, she offered him silence, and between them grew an uneasy camaraderie. Elias explained what she already suspected. The airtight clauses Sterling boasted about were not airtight at all. There were protections the family never accounted for. Whistleblower statutes, spousal discovery rights, the delicate line between ownership and control. He sketched diagrams on legal pads, his pen scratching arrows and underlines while she listened, absorbing every detail. It wasn't revolution she sought, not yet. It was architecture. She stacked facts like bricks, careful and quiet, building a structure she could step into when the time came. When Sloane Hart, Sterling's ex, released a reel on social media with a smile sharp enough to cut, "Can you believe it? The Maid wife. Fairy tales do come true, don't they?" The internet laughed. Hashtags bloomed, memes multiplied, and for a week, Zuri's name was a punchline she never consented to. But she did not rage, not publicly. She saved the clip, cataloged it alongside the invoices, the shell companies, the whispers in the hall. Evidence, not ire. She knew the house she lived in was built on paper more fragile than the marble that lined its walls, and paper, if pressed in the right places, could topple an empire without anyone ever hearing the first crack. Alistair Vale had lived long enough to understand the sea better than most men understood themselves. From the terrace of Seabright, he sat in a deep-backed chair each evening, a cashmere throw folded over his knees, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the Atlantic shifted in colors too restless to be named. His hair, white as foam, caught the twilight like a crown of frost, and his voice, when he used it, carried the weight of low tide pulling back across the sand, measured, patient, inevitable. It was Zuri who first interrupted his vigil. She approached quietly, a glass of water balanced in her hand, her steps careful against the stone. He accepted it with a nod, but instead of dismissing her, he asked, "And what do you see out there?" His question was not a test, not a trap, but a curiosity. She answered honestly. She saw the ocean arguing with the moon, the waves insisting and retreating, never deciding who commanded whom. He chuckled softly, the sound like driftwood scraping rock. After that, the water was never enough. She began to bring stories, fragments of her day, observations she had tucked away, the unspoken truths of a house that called itself mighty but leaked arrogance from its seams. Alistair listened without flinching. He had heard worse from boardrooms and better from janitors. Where others treated Zuri as shadow or scandal, he treated her words as weather, something to be noted, felt, trusted. One evening, when Sterling wandered onto the terrace, late and half-bored, Alistair turned his pale eyes on his grandson and asked what no one else had dared. "Do you know the worth of what you touch?" Sterling, leaning against the rail, answered with percentages, valuations, projections polished into currency. It was a recital, not an answer. Alistair heard poverty in the richness of the boy's math. After that, the old man began to write. Not speeches, not sentimental letters, but codicils. Quiet corrections. A memorandum here, a signature there. Documents drafted with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime building ships and now smelled rot in the hull. His pen strokes were steady, surgical, the work of a patriarch who knew that sometimes preservation required amputation. Zuri never asked what he was writing, though she guessed. She only noticed the way he tucked each paper away with a kind of reverence, as though setting stones in a wall meant to outlast storms. Their conversations continued in low tones, the tide beneath the tide. He was not effusive with praise, nor indulgent with sympathy. He did not need to be. What mattered was the way he listened, the way his presence made her feel less like an interloper and more like someone standing in the right place at the right time. Alistair Vale was not sentimental, he was surgical. And Zuri, watching the tide with him, began to understand that in a house where battles were waged with money and mockery, his kind of precision was the sharpest weapon of all. The storm did not announce itself with thunder, but with whispers, sharp and multiplying, slipping beneath doors and through glowing screens until they became impossible to ignore. Regulators began circling the Vale family's philanthropic arm, questioning disbursements that did not match their headlines of generosity. A junior accountant's email thread leaked to the press, each line a fraying thread pulled from the family's tapestry of perfection. And then Sloane Hart, Sterling's ex, giddy with spite, replayed her smug live stream to millions, only to find her mockery repurposed as evidence. What was once laughter became testimony. Within Seabright, marble walls could not contain the panic. Vivian's fury found its target in Zuri, her voice sharpened into accusation at every breakfast, every corridor, every moment she thought the staff wasn't listening. Sterling, meanwhile, threw blame like confetti, insisting the regulators were jealous, the press corrupt, the world unfair. Yet, through all the noise, Zuri's silence became its own declaration. She did not shout, did not defend herself against ghosts of accusations. She waited. The courtroom was paneled in walnut, the air thick with the weight of old money pretending to be justice. Zuri entered in a charcoal dress, her posture unbending, her eyes steady. She sat straight-backed as if her spine itself were a kind of testimony. Sterling arrived flanked by lawyers and bravado, Vivian a frost-bitten figure in cream silk, her lips pressed so tightly they seemed carved from porcelain. Elias Cortez, his tie knotted neatly but his jaw tight, stood to unravel the map. He spoke with the precision of someone who had carried truth too long and was finally allowed to set it down. Misallocated funds appeared first, projected onto a glowing screen, millions funneled from supposed children's programs into shell accounts with names only Sterling and Vivian could have invented. Vendor testimonies followed, recounting pressure, intimidation, contracts slashed for refusal to comply. And then the charity gala, a glittering night photographed for magazines, revealed itself in invoices. The purchase of a private jet, underwritten by donations. Each revelation landed heavier than the last, and though the marble floors did not tremble, every person seated upon them did. When Sterling's lawyers reached for the prenup, thinking it their shield, Elias turned it into a blade. Clause after clause revealed not protection, but cruelty, painting Sterling as a man desperate to control and punish. In its ink was motive, in its tone was intent, and suddenly the contract that was supposed to silence Zuri had given her a louder voice than she had ever spoken. Then Mr. Dawson, calm as ever, stepped forward with an envelope sealed in a hand no longer steady. Alistair's hand. He delivered it to the judge with a bow of respect, his words carrying the echo of the terrace where an old man once watched the tides. Inside was an amendment, drafted quietly in weeks past, a trust that shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. Alistair had signed over controlling interest in Seabright Holdings, the parent company that gave Vale Capital its backbone, to a neutral stewardship board. At its head, he named Zuri Hayes Vale, not for love, not for scandal, but in his own words, for the preservation of legacy, not ego. The room exhaled as though struck. Vivian paled, Sterling sputtered, lawyers scrambled for air. The marble itself seemed to lean in, a witness to what no one had expected. It did not move, but everyone else did. Their roles upended, their power rearranged. And in the stillness that followed, Zuri sat exactly as she had before, straight-backed, silent, unflinching, because she had always known the tide would turn. The only question had been when. The boardroom carried the sterile scent of disinfectant, polished wood gleaming under lights too bright, the kind of brightness meant to erase shadows but never able to banish them fully. It smelled, too, of something else, of victory waiting quietly in the corners, restrained but undeniable. The long table stretched like a stage where names could be rewritten, fortunes reshaped, legacies redefined. Outside, the Atlantic rolled against the seawall, its rhythm steady, unconcerned with the drama of men and marble. Vivian entered first, her winter white suit tailored within an inch of its life, each button gleaming like a shield. She carried herself as though the room were hers, her heels clicking sharp warnings against the floor. To her, this was still a performance. She adjusted her pearl collar, smoothed her sleeve, and offered a tight smile that never reached her eyes. Sterling stumbled in late, jaw clenched, tie askew as if he had wrestled with it and lost. He slid into a chair with the petulance of a boy dragged into a classroom he thought beneath him. The votes began swiftly, almost mercilessly. The banks and institutional shareholders did not waste time. They loved stability, not boys who mistook inheritance for acumen. Hands raised, papers shuffled, decisions hardened into minutes. Sterling's arguments, when he attempted them, landed dull and defensive, like coins dropped into an empty fountain. Vivian's glares ricocheted off board members who no longer feared her frost. Zuri spoke only when invited, her voice carrying steady as a tide, braids coiled at her crown like laurels she had not asked for, but had earned all the same. She did not posture, did not grandstand. She laid out her vision with the clarity of someone who had memorized the house by its echoes and knew exactly which walls needed rebuilding. Questionable pipelines would be frozen until every ledger could withstand scrutiny. Funds siphoned under the guise of charity would be returned to the communities they were stolen from. The foundation would open its books, seat community members on its board, and stop being a theater for philanthropy and become what it claimed. She promised more than reforms. She promised dignity. Contracts would no longer contain predatory clauses. Employees who had been treated as tools would be elevated as partners. Seabright itself, long a monument to ego, would transform into a model of worth. Not the hollow worth measured in profit margins, but the kind that left a mark no scandal could undo. When a gray-haired director leaned forward and asked if she wanted Sterling formally removed, the room held its breath. Zuri did not hesitate. "I want competence," she said simply. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was clean, stripped of pretense. A silence that felt like agreement before it found its voice. The motion passed. Pens scrawled signatures that would calcify into a new order. Papers dried in the ink of history, and for the first time in years, the boardroom felt less like a battlefield and more like a beginning. Zuri did not smile for the cameras waiting outside the glass doors. She did not pose. She bent over the papers and signed her name, not for applause, not for revenge, but for the future she intended to build. Sometime after midnight, when the rest of Seabright lay hushed and the last of the ballroom chandeliers had been dimmed, the ocean spread itself like breathing onyx, restless yet calm, a mirror too vast to hold in one glance. Zuri walked the terrace where Alistair had once kept his nightly vigil, the cashmere still folded on the chair where his absence felt most present. She pressed Mama Pearl's locket against her sternum, its warmth steady against the cool night air, a heartbeat passed down through generations. The tide exhaled against the seawall, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt Seabright breathe with her instead of against her. The estate was hers now, but she did not treat it like a trophy. She treated it like a living thing, something that required tending, protecting, and listening to. The staff, once uncertain, now stood taller, their wages secured, their futures no longer dependent on whims. Kitchens hummed again, not with tension, but with creation, Camilla's laughter echoing through the corridors like music that belonged. Portraits that once loomed over the halls in silence were rehung so the women's painted eyes gazed at the horizon instead of down at the floor. Even memory could be adjusted, given dignity. Sterling faded into the city like a rumor growing old, his feeds quieter, his condo smaller. Without the house and its stage, he had no script, only silence and headlines already stale. Vivian remained at Seabright for a time, convinced she could still bend the air with her disapproval, but eventually, even she learned how silence feels when there is no audience to feed it. The staff stopped shrinking in her presence. Conversations continued when she entered a room. That was when she began spending more time away, her reflection in mirrors no longer enough to convince her she mattered. Zuri's stewardship did not stop at Seabright's gates. She sought out the seamstresses who had once stitched Sloane Hart's gowns for pennies, women whose hands carried entire worlds, but whose names were never known. She listened to their stories and funded their own label, turning exploitation into enterprise. On a quiet street where she had first learned to read under the glow of a laundromat sign, she restored a community center, stocking it with books, computers, and the promise of space for children to dream without fear. Her legacy began not in the marble halls but in the places she once walked unseen. When a reporter asked her how it felt to win, she thought of the vows that had been weaponized against her, the paper trails she had turned into justice, and the lives that had shifted because she chose responsibility over rage. "I didn't win," she said, her gaze steady as the tide rolling beneath the terrace. "I took responsibility." And in that moment, Seabright ceased to be a monument to ego and finally became a home, belonging to someone who understood the difference between possession and stewardship, between wealth and worth. The ocean breathed on, carrying her promise further than marble ever could. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.